Welcome back to Between Two Racks with the Kilo Crew. On today's episode is another continuation of our previous two episodes, but today we will be covering the hip extensors. So let's kick it. So previously we said we were just going to do the lower back, but then as we kind of looked through what we wanted to cover of this, it kind of became an episode on hip extensors. So to get us started, Steph, I wanted to kind of have you quickly go over why it is important to include this in your programming.
So the hip extensors, this really goes hand in hand. It's a really good continuation of the abdominal episode we did in the previous week. And it's part of that whole core musculature. That's this perfect link between the lower and upper body. And if you're not strong in the lower back, you will have a harder time being really strong with the big primary lifts, like your squats, your deadlift, but even in any type of sporting action or team sports that requires a lot of either acceleration, a lot of force, or even change of direction. And the thing about the hip extensors, or even more specifically the lower back, what I find very interesting is in my early days when I started training at 11, so we're talking about 1988, lower back training and training the hip extensors in general was a big thing. Everybody was doing it, sets and sets of it, twice a week at least. It was this big thing. Whenever you looked at old bodybuilding books or bodybuilding magazines and in sports training, it was just a thing that everybody did, just like everybody did a ton of abs. And then interestingly, in the late 90s, early 2000s, I started seeing people doing a little bit less of it. The big conventional deadlift is always a thing. It's always been, but it's almost like the industry switch from doing a ton of hip extensor work with more basic movements like back extensions and stiff leg deadlift and RDLs and all that kind of stuff to more rehab, prehab type of lower back stuff like bird dogs and prone Superman and stuff like that, which is fine, but it does have a limited impact in the long-term development of hip extensors. So for us, we firmly believe that in order to build a well-rounded, strong, and muscular client, you need to train the hip extensors, and you need to train it in a dedicated fashion across a broad spectrum of exercises to make sure that you're strengthening the entire resistance curve of any exercise you're doing or any movement pattern you're doing in the gym. So, we'll cover a bunch today, some of our favorites or some that are a little less known. But yeah, we're going to cover everything that we can in terms of hip extensors.
So did we want to start the episode off by covering some of the stabilization?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so first we have the glute bridge.
So the glute bridge is a very, very basic introductory exercise into hip extension. This is, you're going to be lying on the ground, knees bent at 90 degrees, and all you're going to do is a very small range of motion hip extension. But this is a great introduction for someone who's trying to learn hip extension because they're in a very, very stable position. They can control, and you can teach them how to control anterior and posterior pelvic tilt so they can get themselves into a better position. They can use a very, very controlled tempo so they can feel the musculature starting to fire, make sure they're pressing with the right muscles, make sure they've full foot pressure. So it's a very easy exercise for people to learn, for you to cue, and to just reinforce good hip extension mechanics. So when you move on to a more complex exercise, that they're in a better position to make sure they've good firing patterns and good motor unit recruitment.
You almost need to look at it as the supine crunch on floor equivalent of hip extension.
100%, yeah.
When people are really struggling with hip extension, I forget who I saw, if it was Porik or Alex. Isn't there something you do where you even just put the person, like a beginner, close to the wall and just kind of have them shoot their hips back to just get that movement pattern down?
Yeah, so that's a great way to teach someone, if you're trying to get them straight into an RDL or a Goodmorning sort of variation that they're controlling their body through space. You have them set up, like I would start as close to the wall as like 2 or 4 inches away, and like, all right, reach your hips back, good. Right, let's take a step further, or not a step, a couple inches further forward. We're going to do the same, reinforce like where you want their knee position, their shin position, their neutral spine, reach further back, and then go until the point that their range of motion is now limited by just mobility. And then once they can do that while maintaining the good mechanics, you can now load them in that position, reinforce the same cues, and they should be carrying out a really good hip extension, whatever variation you've chosen.
Because sometimes it is just someone getting the movement pattern down and not necessarily like a weakness. Sometimes it is, but it's mainly just kind of getting them to really understand the movement pattern. Yeah, especially for a lift or a movement pattern like this that you can't really see yourself doing. Like a lot of things you can see is what's happening in front of you, so it's very easy to understand what you're trying to achieve. Once something's behind you, you see people doing it with rows and stuff as well. Something's behind you, you don't know how it's moving, so you don't have the appropriate reception or the body awareness to know if you're doing it right. So just having visual feedback and cues for them so that, and making it as easy as possible to learn that pattern will really help like get them moving in the right direction.
And it's something that people do like in their everyday life, but they do it wrong every day. So to really teach them how to maintain a neutral spine as they tip over is hard for them to get if they're doing it wrong.
Moving on from the glute bridge, the hip extension supine.
Yeah, hip extension supine is pretty simple. You're laying on your back. You either put your feet, you would start with the feet on the bench where it's a little bit more stable. You're lifting your hips up. It's a great introduction for someone who, again, if you, instead of starting on the incline or the horizontal back extension, I like to use that one for people who are really overweight too, because it's less weight for them to control. And it's a good progression from the glute bridge to.
Just want to clarify that, like what she's describing is feet on a bench, but legs straight. So the knees are not bent, the legs are extended. So you're really like in a straight line in the supine position. So as you're driving your hips forward at the top range, only your head and the top of your upper back will be in contact with the floor, and then your heel and lower calves will be in contact with the bench.
So while Alex said it was a really good progression from the glute bridge, it's a very obvious progression too, because all you're doing is doing the exact same movement pattern with a longer lever. Mm-hmm. So it's just a very gradual step that if someone's really struggling with learning hip extension, going from glute bridge to supine hip extension is a really logical movement.
With these two, overall, generally you're using higher reps, not necessarily lower reps, but you can implement isometric pauses within the programming of these.
Yeah, and you want longer time under tension generally because we're not going to be adding load. So this is going to be body weight. You're going to be doing it for longer time under tension to really reinforce that movement pattern, and then isometric pauses in the contracted position is definitely going to be very helpful.
And then combine that with the fact that it's a short range of motion, so it does kind of by default requires more reps. And the hip extensors are generally more of a slower twitch fiber type. So again, they're more geared towards the hypertrophy, strength endurance, strength quality.
All right, moving on from glute bridge, hip extension, or more basic exercises, one that a lot of people might not be familiar with is the King Deadlift. So I had this one in my programming last year for the first time. It's definitely a lot about the execution of the King Deadlift. And then even when I made the post, it became this whole discussion that is it the King Deadlift, or I think
Skater squat.
Yeah, or this versus the skater squat. So we looked up in the what's his first
Ian King.
Yeah, Ian King in his book
Get Buffed.
Get Buffed. We read that book while we executed it to make sure that we were following the proper execution of the movement. I did message him on Instagram, but he did not answer my message after.
Not very much.
And I do want to add that Alex and I were taught the King Deadlift by Ian King in 2001 as well. So, like, to me, it was still like in my memory, but then we confirmed it with the textbook just to make sure that we had the technique down right.
So the technique for this one is you're either going to have your hands on your hips or arms directly straight down from your shoulders. Then your non-working leg, you're going to bend the knee so the shin is parallel with the ground. From there, you're going to somewhat squat deadlift pattern down, hinging as much as you need to maintain position until your shin reaches the ground.
Yeah.
Sounds simple, but
It requires a lot of
ankle mobility.
Ankle mobility. Why this, or why I think this is King decided this was a King deadlift over a skater squat is because since we're aiming to get the shin to the ground, you have to have a decent amount of forward torso lean, and it makes it a slightly more glute bias exercise. Whereas the skater squat, generally this is done with the hands in front as a counterbalance, allowing slightly more upright posture, allowing slightly more quad activation, and it makes it more of a squatting pattern. So it's a very minor difference, but I'm assuming that's where the differential name came from.
I really liked it in my programming. It's quite the challenge, but I know even with pad blocks, we implement it, but you use something where you're not aiming all the way to the ground, like you're just touching a step or a box. So then you can increase.
Yeah, so like a mid-range King deadlift. Yeah, but so this still falls under stabilization because obviously you can add load with dumbbells, but it's never going to be a very, very heavy load.
Yeah.
But it's stabilization, but it's a far more advanced version of stabilization than the last two exercises we used. So it's got a far more, it's a way better carryover for other aspects than learning hip extension. Like we would never use this to teach someone hip extension. There's far more going on. So it could be really good during like a athlete's transition or early GPP block. So they get better hip stability, hip control, ankle and foot proprioception. So there's a lot more going on with this one. But yeah, I
know it's not the same movement pattern, but in terms of performing the exercise, for some reason, it reminds me of the pistol squat.
Yeah, it's very similar. Yeah. Very similar. You won't get into as much knee flexion, but yeah, very, very similar.
It's like the same type of challenge almost.
Yeah.
Moving on, so then I wanted to go into kind of by bottom range, mid range, top range. So the first bottom range exercise I had is one of our favorites, the Goodmorning. So the seated Goodmorning first.
So the seated Goodmorning is one of our standards. Like we want to be able to, so you're sitting on a bench. You want your knees to be at 90 degrees of flexion. So your feet are directly underneath your knees and your legs are also 90 degrees apart. And the goal is to be able to touch your lower ribs to your inner thigh. I mean, if you have the mobility, you can try to get your chest all the way down. A lot of people have that range of motion. But this is where you get the most like torso to femur. Like that's the closest that you'll get. That's the most extreme range of motion. So we like people to try to work to get to that range of motion.
So you want to get to that range of motion while keeping a neutral spine as much as possible and pivoting at the hips, not just flexing the spine. So what you want to avoid is having that rounded lower back in order to try to reach more range of motion. So don't create a false range of motion by flexing the spine. Like, you really make sure you're staying neutral and you're pivoting at the hips as you're doing the movement.
Yeah.
I know a variation a lot of people see us do and that they like to do when they can't get into the seated good morning, whether it be because they're so tall or just limbs, just how they're built even, or if they don't have the range, is using the decline bench in order to get into a better position to reach that range of motion.
Yeah, so using the decline bench, we can have our hips slightly higher to reduce actually increase the angle at the knee. So instead of being at 90 degrees, maybe 110 or 120 degree knee angle. And so that's you're never going to reach the same level of torso to femur angle at that stage. So like, you might be bent over, but your femur is not going to be parallel with the ground, so it's not going to be just as extreme. So it's going to make it a little easier to reach that torso parallel with the ground position. But one of the real big reasons we love the seated good morning is if we can get strong in that extreme length and range of motion, that their strength is going to carry over up the rest of the strength curve, which is massively important. And if we can get strong at both extremes of the strength curve, it's going to lead to a more robust trainee. So it's going to have great carryover if you can drive up your numbers there.
With the kind of all the good morning variations, one thing that I really like is when you're in the power rack and you set up the pins to the side, to know that you're hitting the range you're supposed to be hitting as well. I find that really helpful as a cue to know that, because sometimes I'll tend to go even too far because I have the range. So then I'm going so far that then I'm losing the proper form. So just having those pins sometimes to know that I'm hitting the right range.
Yeah, especially for the stand ones. Most people don't have the issue with the seated.
Yeah.
Most people, either the bench...
Well, the bench stops me.
Well, that's if you set up that the bench can stop. You could be at the end, but most people don't have the issue with the seated. But for standing good mornings that we're looking for full range of motion, that's a great tip, because
then people tend to shorten their range as they get tired, so it's a really good cue to make sure that they get that full
consistent range.
Consistent.
You know, and a lot of people find themselves, they hit one side first at all times. So they're like, oh, you're sitting off. They're maybe sitting over the one hip a little stronger. Like, so it just gives them a lot of good feedback to readjust throughout the set.
Just want to add with seated good mornings. So if you're dealing with a client that's very flexible, so for example, Alex, if the traditional seated good morning with the knees at 90 degrees, you have no problem hitting the standard of range of motion, and it's not even challenging, you can also do a wide stance seated good morning with your legs straight. So you bend the knees maybe just like 5 degrees to alleviate a little bit of tension at the knee joint, and then you drive your heels into the ground and you dorsiflex the feet. So now you're stretching the posterior chain. So now as you're lowering down, it makes it more challenging to reach the torso parallel to the floor. So for people that have hypermobility and that needs to strengthen like longer range of motion, that's a good variation, the wide stance seated good morning.
I know we kind of started talking about it already, but I had the standing good morning next. Kind of if you wanted to talk about, because we see a lot of people use the standing good morning a lot, but some of the issues we see in technique with standing good morning, like you see people bending their knees way too much.
Yeah, so they're taking away some of the tension from the hamstrings. I mean, the most common thing is really rounding the back. You see people like they start flexing like at the torso instead of pushing the hips back. So that's where it comes back to, if you need to put them in front of a wall so that they know that they're pushing they're trying to reach their butt backwards and not necessarily just like staying in one place. So the knees, the shin angle shouldn't change that much. You can have a slight bend in the knee, but it's really just like reaching back with your butt. and then maintaining that neutral spine.
Yeah, then a simple thing that a lot of people forget to do is use the low bar position.
Yeah.
So if you're using a high bar position, the chances are the barbell is going to start rolling forward and putting a lot of pressure in your neck, which is just not worth it. So roll that bar down like 2 inches.
And a wide grip also helps you anchor the bar into that position.
But yeah, so the last thing you want, get whatever position you can get into that the barbell is not going to roll forward, use that, because the barbell rolling in that bottom position is the worst thing that can nearly happen.
Yeah.
So the bar still needs to stay over your midfoot as you're doing it. So that's another cue you can tell people. If the bar's going over the toes, then something's wrong.
Yeah. We kind of talked about it a little bit, but we did put the pin touch good morning. So I was talking it in terms of like a cue to make sure you're hitting the full range, but there's also...
Yeah, so we can also use this to hit different ranges of motion within the good morning. So we could do it for a mid-range. So we'd be going down. So instead of aiming to get our torso parallel with the ground, we could be going, so we're hitting that the torso is about 35 degrees above where the ground would be, or above parallel from the ground. So what this is going to do is, it could be for a couple of reasons, but say that is someone's range of motion limit, that that's where they're at. So you set the pins up to that point. So it's a reinforcement. All right, go to there, and then slowly try and increase that range as their range of motion increases. Or we can use this as a strength overload for that position. So for the likes of if someone's struggling with their back squat, but due to losing upper back tension or collapsing through the upper back or torso, that 35 degree bent over angle is going to be far more specific to the back squat than the full range of motion good morning. So it could be a really specific way to address that problem. Long term, you want to make sure you include the full range of motion, but it could be one way to include a very specific exercise to address a very specific issue.
Like one thing to add on the pin touch with the good morning, like for the strength coach or dealing with the athletic population, the good morning, and especially pin touch, since you can overload different part of the strength curve with the movement, is really, really important and maybe underutilized with athletes who are in like wrestlers, judo athletes, or even like D-line and football, or even O-line, where you need to not only be strong in the posterior chain at different points in order to dominate your position or your sport, but as you're expressing strength through the posterior chain, you also need to express that strength while building resiliency at the spine. And the thing about the good morning is, because the load comes from a longer lever, you need to have that strong, stable spine as you're exerting force, as opposed to a RDL. So sometimes with these athletes, you need to spend time building that resiliency so they don't get injured in their sporting action. So if you're that DN coming off the edge and you have that O-line on top of your back and you're trying to extend the hip, but most of the load of that O-line is over your head and over your shoulders, well, your spine is going through a lot of pressure. So you need to have that strong structure as you're extending the hip. So to me, the good morning in general, but especially the pin touch, because we can kind of like monitor where we want to overload, becomes a very interesting exercise to add to the arsenal.
I might be totally wrong with this, but is inertia or dead stop anything you would ever use with the good morning?
Yeah.
Okay, so you could.
Especially if you're using the good morning to build someone's deadlift, it'd be really good, because their deadlift, every rep you're overcoming that inertia of a dead stop. So doing it with a good morning is really going to enforce that spinal stability.
Did you do it in the last year at one point?
I'm not sure. I have it on Friday though. Oh. It's funny enough.
Yeah.
He did have, if I'm not mistaken, last year he had incline back extension mid-range inertia with a
that's
barbell.
That's what it was.
Oh, yeah.
That was a nightmare to set up.
That's what I was thinking.
But I just thought about this before we keep on going with this discussion. I just, for the viewers, I just want to explain and clarify what we mean by bottom, mid, and top range. So some of you might not even know what we're talking about. So with your posterior chain exercise, especially when it comes to like purely hip extensors, depending on the movement you're doing, you will stress a different part of the strength curve. And over time, you want to make sure that you stimulated all of these points to have this wide range of stress across the entire strength curve. So when we're saying bottom range, we're talking about exercises where the majority of the stress or the overload is when the torso is at a closing angle to your femur. So like the seated Goodmorning, like we were saying earlier, would be the greatest example of the extreme of bottom range, because most of the stress is in the bottom when the torso is parallel to the floor. And at that point in time, you have this very narrow angle between the femur and torso. We're talking about like maybe 10, 15 degrees. Okay, so this would be bottom range. Whereas mid-range, now a good example, a very simple one, would be your incline back extension. So by the time that the torso is displacing and you have the highest amount of load on the posterior chain, the torso is parallel to the floor. But if you're looking at the torso to femur angle at that point, you're probably like at 135 degree or something like that. So that's why we're saying mid-range. And then top range would be exercises like reverse hyperextension or horizontal back extension, where now most of the stress is on top, again, when the torso is parallel to the ground. But if you're looking at the horizontal back extension, when the torso is parallel to the ground, the torso is also aligned with the femur as a straight line. So this is the top range, where you're completely upright when you're at 180 degree of hip extension. So as you're rotating through these different exercises through time, you're making sure that you're strengthening the entire points of the strength curve to have this strong posterior chain.
Okay, so then speaking of moving on from bottom range to mid-range, the first mid-range I had was the incline back extension. So obviously we have all the back extensions here at Kilo, and we think it's important to train all of them. So with the incline back extension, if you wanted to kind of go, there are also different variations we use. I love the unilateral back extension to do on any of them.
So the incline back extension is as straightforward as it sounds. You are on an incline back extension, you hook your feet in. Preferably you have one that you can play about with the angles. It's a luxury, but it's very nice. It's very nice to have. So we generally have our setup that it's about a 45 degree, but sometimes we lower it so you're going through less. Well, you get through as much of a stretch, but the overload happens slightly higher up. Sometimes we raise it up that the overload happens a little lower. But so as you go through the range of motion, you go the whole way down. Once you pass the torso being parallel to the ground, you're automatically starting to get deloaded, because the torso is where the overload's coming from and where gravity's acting on the hip extensors. So you're going down, you're starting to get deloaded, and the way back up, you start to get, the load starts to build. It peaks when the torso is parallel to the ground, and then it drops off slightly for the remainder of the range of motion. But yeah, it's a very simple exercise, but it's a great exercise for driving volume, because you don't need an awful lot of load and you're in a very stable position. You're not worried about losing balance or overly fatiguing of any stabilizer muscles. But yeah.
I was going to say the most common error is people not setting up the pads properly. Yeah. Like you want to make sure that the pad is like on your hip bone so that you can get that full range of motion, or else it'll force you to kind of round your lower back. Yeah. So you want to make sure you...
Yeah, so you definitely don't want it too high to force you to lower back. You don't want it too low, because it's going to dig into your quads. So find that middle ground that it's comfortable, but you still can allow your hips to rotate very naturally.
But generally speaking, the incline back extension for your general population client, once you're past with the stabilization movements, this would be the first hip extension movement you would add to the mixed, because it's a little less daunting for the client. It's a little less scary than a horizontal back extension. you're stressing mid-range, but you're not stressing bottom range. So it doesn't require this extreme range of motion from the get-go. So you kind of get that, best of both worlds in the sense that you're stressing the mid-range with some carryover to the top, some carryover to the bottom range. So this is typically the starting point past the stabilization.
And then in terms of loading progressions, we usually start with loading with holding like a plate or dumbbell in front. And then would it go to the barbell in front?
Barbell in front, barbell on back. If it's awkward, but if someone can do it. And the problem with barbell on back is you are somewhat limited by load, because if you go into the full range of motion and you're hanging, your body is pretty much upside down. You have to be able to maintain that load there. Yeah. And just, it's not even get back up, it's maintain the load in that position, because it's going to want to roll forward. Yeah. So it nearly reverts back to barbell in front once they reach a certain level of strength if you're trying to do a full range of motion. But complexity wise and progression wise, you'd be going dumbbell in front, barbell on back.
Yeah. I mean, barbell in front it's my favorite. It's the most versatile of the bunch, but the only drawback to it is you need to have a back extension machine that's built high enough that you're not restricted with range of motion. If the machine is too low to the ground, you're kind of stuck doing partial reps.
But one of the great benefits of the barbell in front is generally you're going to do it wide grip to make sure you have enough range of motion, but then you're getting an additional like 3 or 4 sets of 40 to 60 seconds time under tension for upper back to maintain that scapular position. So it's like you're getting a very nice carryover on a lower body day to an upper body issue. And
the accentuated eccentric is also great for that, when you lift, so concentrically you're holding the dumbbell on your chest. Once you get to the top, you extend your arms overhead. So now we're making the lever a lot longer, so that it's a good way to overload without necessarily using a lot of extra weight. And you get a little extra trap 3 work.
Yep. Blast the trap 3.
Yeah.
And then another one we have for mid-range is the Romanian deadlift. So I did, Alex, kind of want you to go over what we look for in proper form with the RDL.
So the RDL, the movement is exactly the same as your Goodmorning, but this time you're holding either dumbbells to your side or a barbell in front of you. And the RDL is really just a slight bend. We see a lot of people bend the knees too much and they make it look like almost like a squat in the bottom. But the first movement is, again, pushing the hips back, maintaining a neutral spine. And then your hands should basically just go to mid-shin. Like you're not trying to reach the floor with just a slight bend in the knee. So once you break at the knee as you're lowering, the knee angle stays the same. And then you're really just trying to get a little bit more stretch in the hamstring, pushing the hips back. And then you initiate with the glutes, trying to cue that a lot.
Like it gets confusing a little bit because there's like the Romanian deadlift and then there's the semi-stiff leg deadlift. Yeah. There is a difference, but it's like really minute semantics. So the semi-stiff leg deadlift, we're talking about like, you're bending the knees just enough to take away the slack. Theoretically speaking, they say it's like 15 degree-ish. Whereas, so then the semi-stiff, you're going to have a huge bias towards the hamstring. Whereas the Romanian deadlift, you're bending the knees a little bit more. We're talking about 20 to 25 degrees, so it's very small. So you have a slight bias more towards the glutes. But I'm using the word bias because it's not like both are going to work the hamstring and the glutes, but it's a slight difference. So the RDL, you'll usually be able to use a little bit more weight. And the reason why Alex is saying to go down to mid-shin, that you don't necessarily need to go down further, is simply because most people, unless you have a very imbalanced arm to torso dynamics, by the time you reach mid-shin, the torso will be parallel to the ground. So like by going further down, you're not necessarily increasing the tension significantly.
One thing most people mess up with this is I find a lot of people underload their RDL.
so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So much.
Like you see them finish their set and it's like, okay, it was maybe a heavy weight respectively to everything else, but you had another 7 or 8 reps in the tank.
Yeah.
They're so far away, whether it's due to you are in somewhat of a vulnerable position injury wise, but like if you're maintaining technique, it's gonna be fine.
Like technically on a rep for rep being equal, you should be able to RDL the same, like a little bit more actually than what you're squatting.
Yeah.
Or deadlifting?
Yeah, exactly.
Squatting or
No,
deadlifting?
No,
Squatting.
squatting.
Oh.
Yeah. So
I'm thinking.
you should be using a ton of weight
Yeah.
on your RDLs once you're solid with technique.
You have it. I mean, it's hard to figure out for the simple reason that you squat in the A series and you
and I have it
RDL in the
GBC
C series.
right now, so I'm
Yeah.
not comparing
Yeah.
apples to apples.
Yeah.
Yeah, but because you're doing it in the C series, typically the remedial, you have more reps. But if you were to translate that to a 1RM, it
Yeah.
would be fairly equivalent.
Yeah, like I had it. It technically was in my C series, but it was part of a complex, and I was doing
Yeah, I remember that,
significantly
yeah.
more than what I can squat.
And
Yeah,
when you
same rep.
over 400,
Like 435.
Yeah.
I cannot squat 435.
You were using straps. That's
Yeah.
not what Next, I have another variation of the RDL, the B stance RDL.
So the B stance is a really cool variation. So obviously you can do completely single leg RDLs, which can be great for hip stability and ankle stability, proprioception, all that there. But you're extremely limited in load just because you're now fighting with standing up and staying upright. Whereas the B stance, you're using your support leg as somewhat of a kickstand, and it just provides the stability you need. But it's a great variation because it's obviously very unilateral dominant, but it's also going to change your body position and how you load the musculature, just because while you're using the other leg for a balance, since you're predominantly creating force off one leg, it naturally comes more into the midline of your body. So that alone is going to change how the muscles are getting loaded and which muscle fibers need to be recruited to create the movement. So just using this as a change of pace, if you have no other rationale, as a change of pace, you're going to create a different stimulus for hip extension strength and hypertrophy. But yeah, it's really good. You can load it in lots of ways. You can do dumbbells, you can do ipsilateral, contralateral, bilateral dumbbell, and then
Low
barbell,
pulley.
low pulley. Like there's loads of ways to load it to like change the variations,
bias,
even
yeah.
the bias even more. Like say you're doing a contralateral, it's a great way to challenge hip extension while challenging like torso anti-rotation. Like something simple as that there. So if someone's got these somewhat of a low back issue that you want to limit their weight that you're using in their hip extension exercise while getting more abdominal work in, it's a very simple way of doing it.
Okay, moving on to top range. The first one is we have the hip thrust. So
Everyone's favorite.
well, speaking of the hip thrust, when we did not have a hip thrust machine when we had our facility in Huntington Beach, California, but then when we were moving to Miami, we reached out to Atlantis because Alex and I were like, Steph, we're moving to Miami.
We got to work on
We
the
need
booty.
the hip thrust. But everyone really likes it
Yeah.
now that we
Yeah.
have it.
And I mean, we like the machine way more than the barbell just for comfort reasons. It's got a good
I have
pad.
never performed a hip
No.
thrust with a barbell.
No, me neither. I mean, I've done, I guess, with like just a dumbbell that I would do, like, you know, from a hip thrust on the bench, or if I'm doing unilateral and stuff. But yeah, the barbell just digs into you.
It
and
sucks.
It really sucks.
Well, beyond just that, it's just the loading.
Yeah.
Like the
And you have to load so
you have
much.
to load
Like-
so much, it takes forever. Like, you know, like you've been doing deadlift and squat, and like now you're at the end of your workout and you need to load like 5 plates aside again. I'm like,
It's so much. But key things to look at when you're doing the hip thrust is is you want to make sure you want to keep it out of the lower back. So you want to make sure that you're doing a pelvic tilt so that you're maintaining that. You're not overarching the back so that you don't feel the tension there. You really want to focus on the glutes, even if you have to add a little pause on top, get a little extra squeeze. And then you want the knees, when you're in that full hip extension position, you want the knees bent at 90 degrees. So you have to kind of you have to try to figure out that position so that you don't feel it too much in the quads. So make sure that the feet aren't too high or too low on the platform. And another trick that I learned is also just to keep the chin tucked in. It's really hard to hyperextend your back if your chin is tucked in. Mm-hmm. So as you lift up, if you can lift your head up off the bench to maintain that.
Then perform them unilaterals great.
Oh, yeah.
Just make sure your machine doesn't weigh 130 something pounds because it makes it very hard, but it's a great variation.
A lot of people can't even do that. I mean, I know that for myself, when I was like coming back from my surgery and stuff, just doing the hip extension, the hip thrust, one leg on a bench with no weight is like really hard. So a lot of people can start there.
Yep.
The next one we're moving on to is the horizontal back extension. So we covered incline back extension and now horizontal back extension.
So the horizontal back extension, it's very similar to the incline back extension, but this time the point of overload is going to be when the torso is parallel with the floor. Oh, well, sorry, it's going to be in both of them. So the torso is going to be parallel to the floor, but the torso is also going to be in line with your femur. Yep. So all the load's going to be at the very top. What I really like about the Atlantis one is that instead of having a foot pad behind, like you see a lot of people doing horizontal back extensions on glute ham raises, which is fine, but since the foot pad's behind, people tend to push their toes back into that foot pad, which takes some of the pre-stretch off the hamstrings, whereas the Atlantis horizontal back extension has a toe bar in front, so you naturally pull your toes into it, creating a little bit more of a pre-stretch, which is just it's a small bonus, but I always found it very, very helpful, and it always improved the quality of the exercise for me.
And their machine is high enough that you can load it with a barbell in front pretty easily as well.
Yeah, like it's a very straightforward machine, but it's just the small things done right really help. Same thing that Alex said about the incline back extension, that you want the pad set up to be just before the hip bone, so you can get a full rotation of the hips without like having to bend at the back. And you don't want to be too much under your quads because it's going to dig into the quads. So just find that middle ground.
And I will say though, like so let's say you're a gym owner and you do have the space and you don't have a restricted budget. I understand that you can do horizontal back extension on a glute ham raise, but if you can, doing it on an actual horizontal back extension machine is a little bit better. It's a little bit more effective because you have more of that clean cut separation of the hinge pattern, yep. Whereas sometimes on the glute ham, because if it's a oval or circular padding, too often the top of the circular point will be that hinge point, which means that you'll be limited in bottom range because of that cylinder padding. So if you really want, let's say you're training especially the athletic population and you want to emphasize range of motion and strength through a full range of motion, you'll gain a little bit more by actually using a true horizontal back extension machine because it's just way more of a clean cut difference at the hinge point.
For you with programming with the incline or horizontal back extension, besides the incline being what you would introduce first for more like beginner trainees, is it just kind of, are there specific reasons you choose the incline over the horizontal?
There is, but it's multifactorial. Yeah. So like once you're dealing with a client that is intermediate to advanced, that you've been through the whole like progression structure, it really depends on the structure of the microcycle, which would be based on the limiting lift. So depending on if you're doing a conventional deadlift in your training week, well, I'm not going to train the incline back extension again simply because a conventional deadlift has a huge midpoint bias through the movement, so I might prioritize doing the horizontal instead. Or if, let's say, I'm training the squat, although it's not a clear-cut situation, I do like to use the incline back extension because the angles carries over very well at helping the torso positioning during the squat pattern. So, but it's like there's a lot of factor involved. It depends on what we've been doing in the previous phase, on what we're thinking of doing in the upcoming phase. So there's lots of factors involved. But like one key point though, like if you're uncertain, is just make sure that on the bigger picture, so when you're looking at the macro cycle, that you have a rotation of stress point in the strength curve.
But one, like the horizontal back extension, I find is definitely an exercise that a lot of people are extremely weak in. So the seated Goodmorning and the horizontal back extension, the two extremes, it's where people really struggle. Like people undertrain. People are strong in the RDL, but they undertrain it. But the seated Goodmorning and the horizontal back extension, people are just weak. So,
and also there's something to be said simply to the fact that most commercial gym across the world, if they have one back extension machine, it's typically the incline back extension.
yeah.
So it's often a angle that people are used to do way more. And of course, the one nobody ever does would be that seated Goodmorning. But yeah, Porik's right. Like usually the extreme ranges are the most problematic area with most people.
The final exercise I have for today's episode is nobody's favorite, the reverse hyperextension. So I know with this one, I mean, even ours, like is heavy to begin with. So we have a lot of people just get on it, but not use the pads to actually perform it. But man,
it's just so uncomfortable. But you just gotta.
I like it because it feels like I know I'm training it properly, but it's just like such a sucky one.
You get all the benefits of the horizontal back extension. It's the same movement, but this time the torso's fixed and it's the lower body that's moving. I mean, and you have to be able to brace properly because the pad is going to be like just digging into your stomach and stuff. But it's a great deload for the lower back, and I mean, I don't know what else to really say about it.
Well, it's great. Like Alex said deload, but what she meant is it's good at decompressing the spine coming off of like heavy. So let's say you're doing a heavy deadlift or heavy squat cycle where the spine is being compressed all the time. To add the reverse hyper is just a good way to just create more space to decompress that spine because the lower body is heavier. So as the legs are coming back down, you have a little bit more of that like dynamic stretch component to it. For athletic performance, it's a good exercise to introduce as you get closer to the competitive season. There's, depending on the machine you have, there's a little bit more of a dynamic component to it. If you're using like the traditional West Side, actually the way it's built, you kind of have to go fast doing it. Whereas the one we use from Atlantis, it's way easier to control the speed. Plus, the bottom position is not as extreme in flexion, so it's not as damaging, quote unquote, damaging on the spine because it's not a overstretch. So you have a little bit more control. You can control the tempo a little bit better. There's different points of overload on the machine, so you can actually load the machine to stress the bottom to midpoint. You can overload it in a way to stress more the mid to top range. You can overload it equally to have more of a standard overload. You can do it unilateral, which I really like as a hip stabilizer. You can do it wide stance, which you're going to have a little bit of a glute medius component, especially if you internally rotate the femur, dorsiflexing the feet. I mean, so there's a lot you can do with it, but obviously the drawback, like they were saying, is it's very uncomfortable. So when you're doing it for a high rep, like the breathing gets a little hard. And but otherwise it's a really good exercise.
Like I do really like that ours comes with 2 different points of overload. So like once they're able to use the pad and use the arm, so say you're just using the empty arm the first time with them, then if you were going to start adding weight, you can add it so it comes on a little earlier and drops off at the top. So it's a more gentle way to add weight, and then you can do it so you can eventually get them so it's overloading the top even further. But it gives you a little more play with how quickly you can add load for people compared to something that just overloads the top no matter what.
And even on a program design perspective, if you want to manage fatigue with a client, so let's say you have a client where the macro cycle is hypertrophy dominant, so the volume of training will be higher, and you want to mitigate fatigue, what you can do, you're doing the reverse hyperextension and you load it to overload the top in your accumulation phase. So it's a little bit less stress on the tissue. You can afford to do more volume of work, more volume load on the movement, and you're going to recover from it. Whereas if you're doing it in the intensification with less volume, now you could actually lower the bottom range, where now you're creating more stress to the tissue because the point of overload is in a stretched position. So you're creating a little bit more muscle damage. So to do it in intensification phase with less volume will allow you to recover a little bit better. So it just allows you to mitigate the recovery factors involved in your planning. So it's pretty cool.
I know I said nobody's favorite, and I think it is based on like just the comfort of the exercise, but personally it's just because I have it in a GBC right now for 15 reps and it's just miserable.
You just like jumping on it.
I do like getting on and off of it.
But it's funny because like the reverse hyper from Atlantis, like I used it like 20 years ago, and it was uncomfortable because the padding was flat. And what happened is the edge of the padding would dig into like the lower ab / hip area, and then they used a half moon, which was more comfortable because of that aspect. So basically they used the half moon of a glute ham to make it more comfortable, but then because of that it digs into the abdomen more. So that's a little less comfortable. But now their newer model from like a year and a half ago or so, they're back to the flat padding. But I think if I'm not mistaken, they kind of rounded the edge.
Yeah, they pretty much, it looks closer to the padding that they use in the incline back extension. So it's like, I think it's called a bulldog. I could be wrong about that. But yeah, so it's curved at the edge instead of being a straight, hard edge.
So it might be the best of both worlds in terms of comfort.
And their new one is now selectorized, which would be really interesting.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so the point of overload is slightly different, and obviously your micro adjustments are a lot easier.
Yeah.
Okay, so do we have any other exercises or programming parameters, anything we'd like to include on the hip extensors for today's episode?
I mean, the one, like my favorite of the entire bunch personally, maybe it's because I was good at it, but it's the Goodmorning. I think the Goodmorning is great. I think it's underrated. I think it's underdone, undertrained. But I also think that if you're going to specialize on it or add it to your training, you should also consider rotating. And by rotating, I'm not saying workout to workout, but through time, rotating the implements used, because it does changes the stress, the point of overload. And it changes the grooving of it. So like you have the standard barbell where you're going in a low bar squat position. You have the safety bar. You have the cambered bar, which personally is my favorite to do it. I just find it very comfortable, especially if you're holding it to the side. It's hard though, because I mean the point of overload is a little different. The safety bar is really cool too, and I remember at Polican Group they had the Powerlift safety bar. That's the biggest safety bar I've ever seen in my life. It was huge, and you had 2 sets of handles. You had one that was wide and really long, so it was almost like you're doing cambered bar, but with a safety bar. That was pretty cool. But like if you want to decrease monotony and decrease the likelihood of overuse type injuries, rotating or changing the implement will go a long way, because you are recruiting different motor units because of different points of overload and grooving. But it is a good one. It's just a very challenging one.
Yeah. The safety bar tries to kill you.
Yeah.
Because it sits higher, doesn't sit in a fully low bar position. So you'll find there's way more stress in the upper back. The load, depending on what the safety bar is and how you hold the handles, the load could be even further in front of your feet than normal, because of the way the camber's shaped. So definitely be conservative the first time you use the safety bar, because it's and have your safety pins
and
in the right spot.
You want a challenge, and I'm saying this only for the truly advanced. If you want a challenge, isometronics, Goodmorning.
Jesus.
That's pretty cool.
Bottom range.
Bottom range. I do more mid range of it, but it's pretty cool too.
So that's when you're going in between, and then
So I mean the big
it.
difference between because isometronic is a form of functional isometric. So you're using a power rack with two sets of pins. So you have the safety pins, and then you have an extra set of pins. So you're basically traveling through in between these two pins. So you set the bottom pins at your end point. So let's say parallel to the ground. And then depending on where you want to overload, so let's say bottom range, you have the second set of pins. So now with the bar, you're moving from the bottom set to the top set. Bottom set, top set, bottom set, top set. So isometronic, it's the same thing, but you're reducing the range of motion to maybe 6 inches, just enough to build some type of momentum and tension in a dynamic isotonic action. So let's say you're 6 inches. So top range is your top pins. You lower the bottom range 6 inches lower. So you go from then up, there, up for 5-6 reps. Then the 6th rep, you push into the top pins as hard as you can for 6 to 8 seconds. Come back down. Then you go up for a 7th rep. And the cool thing about this one is it's load dependent. So if you're able to touch the top pins on the 7th rep, it means you need to go up in weight. So it's a combination of short dynamic action with one all out 6 to 8 second isometric contraction. So the load is a factor, whereas the functional isometric, technically speaking, you could do it with an empty barbell. It's just about you pushing as hard as you can onto the immovable object. So it's slightly different because of the time under tension and load component.
On that note. So we will be leaving for our Euro trip in 2 days. So Amsterdam fam, everyone joining us this Saturday, we will see you bright and early at the 4 Elements Hotel for the comprehensive periodization seminar. That will be a jam-packed 1 day of content with one break. So get ready, review your periodization online course if you have it, because it's going to be a lot of information and lots of fun. Again, thanks for tuning in. Drop us a like, subscribe. Thanks, fam.